April 1st. It came out on April 1st, and it was like Christmas for dedicated genealogists. We were like online all day. I didn't answer my email. I didn't take phone calls. I was searching the 1950 census. So there's some interesting things and some challenges that are presented by the 1950 census. So I'm going to give you a little background on census in general. We're going to cover why census records are important to genealogists. We'll talk a little bit about the history of the US federal census, and then I'll show you some examples of actually searching in the 1950 census. So a census record is a systematic recording of information about a specific population. It's often regularly occurring. Here in the United States, we take it every 10 years. It's the government's official count of the population. Sometimes that's for a country, but sometimes it's done by a state or a Canadian province or a specific city. Even religious bodies will do what they call a census. In Canada, they take their census on the years ending in 1. In the US, we take them on years ending in 0. And it's really important to think about why a census record is created, because very often I'll be working with someone and I'll say, oh, I found your family in the census. And they'll ask a question like, does it say when my grandpa died? It's not going to say information like that. A census is taking a snapshot of the country on one specific date. And the reason why a census is so important to the genealogist is because it is grouping a family together. It's putting a whole household together. They also provide basic demographic information that helps you to track down other resources. A census might tell you about immigration date or naturalization date. It'll give an indication as to when someone was born, which might help you track down a birth certificate, or how long the couple's been married to a marriage record, or if someone has disappeared from the household, it might be an indication that you need to look for a death record. It also will tell you sometimes if someone was in the service, military service, and so it helps you to track down other types of important genealogical records. So one question people have asked is, why is the 1950 census being released now? Well, they have this thing called the 72-year rule. And I used to tell my class that this was for privacy reasons and that this was the date they picked based on life expectancy. And I have learned otherwise. It's released once the record is 72 years old, it is released because that is when the Census Bureau transferred records to the National Archive. Follow me if you will. Access to personally identifiable information contained in census records is restricted until the census record is 72 years old. The Census Bureau first transferred its census records to the National Archives back in the 40s. So from 1790 to 1870, census records were made available immediately. One copy was sent to the Census Bureau in DC, and another copy was held at the local courthouse. So anyone could go into the local courthouse and look at the census record. However, that would only be in your town. You would have to travel from county to county to county to county to county throughout the United States to look at it all, right? But that's how it was done up until 1870. From 1880 to 1940, only one copy of a census record was made, and it was sent to the Census Bureau and kept closed to the public. The aggregate data, all the statistical information, was gathered and released to the public immediately as soon as it was all tabulated, but not the information that was recorded about the individuals, just the number of people who lived in a town, maybe the ethnic, racial divisions in the community, general age of the population. That kind of data was released, but not the names and stuff. In 1934, the National Archives and Record Administration, which we call NARA, that was formed. In 1942, the Census Bureau transferred its census records to NARA. NARA decided to open all the census records that had been transferred. Those are the 1790 through 1870 ones. They opened them to the public. In 1952, the Census Bureau transferred the 1950 census to NARA under the condition that they would wait to release that information until it was 72 years old, just as when they released the 1880 information in 1952. So that is what established that 72-year rule. It wasn't necessarily life expectancy. However, at the time this law was made, it sort of coincided with life expectancy. There's one exception to that. In 1973, they released the 1900 census rather than in 1972. And that is because when they were recording the 1970 census, the public raised some concerns about privacy. And so the National Archives waited until they had heard from the US Attorney General that it was okay to release it. So it was slightly delayed. Now, each census has a highlight. There's some unique information that is collected in each census. Now, the 1790 was the first one. From 1790 to 1840, the records only present the head of the household's name and then how many people were living in the house, which is tabulated in little categories with little hash marks. In 1850, that's the first census that lists every single member of the household by name. The 1860 is the last census to have something called slave schedules. Slaves were not identified by name. They were listed under the slave owner's name, and they were listed only by age and sex. There's no list of names. After the emancipation in 1870, when they took that census, that was the first one to list formerly enslaved people by name. Very important census if you're doing African-American research. For many, the 1870 poses a brick wall for African-American researchers, but it's not impossible to go further back. If you've been watching Finding Your Roots, there are many instances where they find information that can push an African-American line further back. However, that's the significance of the 1870. The 1880 is the first census that identifies the relationship between each member of the household to the head of household. Now, why is that important? Because often we would just assume that the oldest male at the top would be the head of household, and then the oldest female listed beneath them would be the wife. But sometimes there are instances where the wife has passed away, and instead what you have living with him is perhaps a sister or a sister-in-law. So this is the first one that becomes really important. Sometimes there are cousins in a household, sometimes there are lodgers in a household, and we don't have to assume anymore because it'll say what the relationship is. 1890 no longer exists. It was destroyed in a fire. Actually, it did not burn up in the fire. It was damaged by putting out the fire, but it no longer exists except for a few fragments of it. The 1900 census is one of my favorites. It reports the month and year of birth for each person listed. It's also the first one to record the date of immigration of people. And it asks something called the maternity questions. They asked women, every adult woman, how many times she had given birth and how many living children she had. That was because the country was concerned with infant mortality rates. And so they asked these questions. The 1910 census is notorious for its lousy microfilming. So after they microfilm a census, they destroy it. The paper no longer exists. We only have the film. And so it was poorly microfilmed, and it's really all we have to work with. They have been making lots of effort to improve the quality of it, but there's no way to remake the microfilm. They're just trying to enhance the digitized records. The 1900 census also includes those maternity questions, which are great for finding out about infants who might have died between the census. So let's say they were born in 1902 and you have no record of them because they died before 1910. This census can help you figure out if there were lost children or deceased children, really. 1920 is the only census to record the year of naturalization. 1930 asked your family if they owned a radio. And that is because during the Depression, our President Roosevelt was communicating with the country by his fireside chats, which were broadcast over the radio. So the government wanted to know who was listening. In 1940, it was the first census in which they asked sampling questions, an extra set of questions of 5% of the population. It was also the only census who notes who answered the questions. And now we have, if you want to learn more, this is a really great resource. I gave this URL to Allison to share later, but this Measuring America came out in 2002, and it's a really intense comparison between the questions asked over time in each census and the instructions that were given to the enumerators, another word for census taker, as to how to conduct their recording. But pages 119 through 124 are fascinating. It shows you every question that was ever asked. It's really kind of cool. So if you're like nerdy about census records like I am, you can go and check out this publication. It's really very cool. But let's get to this 1950. So there's a ton of stuff we can learn by looking at this new census. You always want to begin your research with the most recently available records. You want to work backwards from time. And part of that is because you want to be able to either know the information you're looking for or to be able to confirm the information you're finding with someone living. So I know my father was born in 1949. When I find him in the census, I'll be sure that I am looking at the right thing. And then you would proceed backwards in time to the 1940, to the 1930, tracking the same family. You know, you're not skipping any decade. You're trying to get a whole complete line. That makes this 1950 census really, really important to new researchers because it's going to be where they start from. And you really want to make sure you read all the answers to all the questions. And we're going to look at the questions that were asked. Again, there's a difference between the census date and the enumeration date. So a census, again, is a snapshot of a single day in time in our country. The census date for the 1950 census was April 1st, 1950. The enumeration date is the day the census taker knocked on the door. So they might not have shown up on the 1st. They might have gotten there on the 5th or the 7th, right? So the questions that they asked, though, were pertinent to the enumeration date, the census date. All the questions asked had to pertain to April 1st, 1950, the census date. So if your relative was born on April 2nd, 1950, they should not be in the census, even if that enumerator showed up on April 5th. Everything had to pertain to April 1st. Similarly, if a person the census taker shows up on April 5th and someone in that household died on April 1st, they were supposed to be counted. But if that person died on March 31st, they shouldn't have been counted. It was only April 1st. That's the only day they were concerned about. So talk a little bit about census release. Prior to 1940 census, microfilm copies were archived. And when they were made public, they were released when they were 72 years old to libraries and archives across the country. Online versions of the 1790 through 1940 censuses are available through the efforts of digitization. libraries, companies, and organizations digitizing those older records. 1940 census came out on April 2nd, 2012, and it was the first one to come out directly online. They didn't distribute it to libraries or archives. It came out straight online. And it was made freely available to anyone who had internet access on April 2nd, 2012. So you know where I was at my computer. The indexing for the 1940 census was done through something called crowdsourcing. More than 163,000 volunteers transcribed those records. I volunteered to do it through Family Search. They gave me a section and I went in and typed up what I read. And that is how the index was created, through hundreds of thousands of people volunteering to do it. It was estimated that the 1940 census would take about a year to fully transcribe, but we did it in 4 months. Now, the 1950 census is the first to have its search function powered by artificial intelligence and machine learning and something called optical character recognition, or OCR. A machine did this. A machine went through, looked at all the images, and tried to read that penmanship and create an index that was searchable. However, it really needs to be fully indexed and transcribed. And they estimate that the completion of that will happen in October. Presently, the only way to access the information in the 1950 census is to know the location. However, there was a big announcement, like I saw it online an hour ago. Amy Johnson Crow, a very noteworthy genealogist, announced on Facebook today that Ancestry announced that they've published the entire 1950 census index. It's hard to believe. That would mean that we've done it in a little over than a month to have the entire census indexed. She is going live right now. If you need to leave me, she's going live right now on YouTube to discuss what this means and the Family Search volunteer effort that's been done to create this index. There is her YouTube address. She's going to record it. You can watch it later. Talking about this index and how quickly it was made. But census are not organized by address. They are organized by enumeration district, which means you need to know where the person lived. So in order to find your family, you need to find the enumeration district that they lived in. And I'm going to show you how to do that. So here's some things to know about the 1950 census before we look at it. 1940 was the first time they provided information about who was the informant, who answered the questions at the door. And if you've looked at the 1940, next to the person who answered the questions is a circle with an X through it. That shows that was the answerer. And that was a really helpful thing because it provided some tool by which to judge the reliability of the answers. So for example, maybe the head of household answered the questions, or maybe the mother had answered the questions, maybe one of the kids did. And if you see that, you think, well, maybe these ages are off, or maybe the occupation isn't correct. In any case, that wonderful tool did not exist in 1950. They did not record who answered the questions in 1950. 1950 is also the last time residents were asked questions about their naturalization status. So that information will disappear going forward. The income questions that were asked in the 1940 census became very controversial. So in the 1950 census, they were dropped from the general public's questions and they were moved to the sampling lines. I had mentioned before that they asked sampling questions in the 1940 census. Well, they did it again in 1950. 1950 is also the first time college students were officially counted at their college. And that's to be consistent with the rule that each person should be counted where they usually reside. Prior to that, if you had college students, they were supposed to be counted at home, even though they weren't living at home. If they were international students and living on campus, they were counted there. whole mishmash of information. So this was the first time college students were officially counted at their colleges. The 1950 census is the last time an enumerator or census taker personally visited households with those large sheets that we're used to seeing. In 1960 and since, we relied on self-enumeration. That's when you get that form in the mail you have to fill out and mail back. Yeah. So who knows what the 1960 census will look like. Prior to 1950, these big census sheets had a page 1A, and then the back was page 1B. And the next page was 2A, and the back was 2B, etc. That's not how they numbered them in 1950. 1950, they just go 1, 2, 3, 4. There's no need for a back of the page. So it was the first true concerted effort of a census taker to find every home and record every person. If you've looked at it, and we're going to, there will be many places where it says no one was home. In the past, the census taker just had to write down who they went back to. Not in 1950. 1950, they wrote down who wasn't home, right on the form. And there was a rule too in 1950 that when you make the second set of visits, when you return to all those homes of no one home, the page numbering began on page 71. So you might open your enumeration district and see it's 20 pages. Why is it so short? Well, the first 10 pages will be numbered consecutively, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or however far they got. And when they started to the second visit, the page number jumps to 71. So you might see gaps in the numbering. Don't assume pages are missing. The pages are there. It's just the system that they use. It's a little toasty in my office. So what questions were asked? 1950 had 20 questions that were asked of all people. It was a little shorter than the 1940 census, but it had very little changes because many of the questions that they stopped asking from the 1940 census, they asked in 1950, but they asked them in the sampling questions. Now in 1940, there were 80 lines per sheet, and 4 of those lines were asked these sampling questions. That's about 5% of the population. In 1950, there were 30 lines per sheet, and 6 of those lines were singled out for sampling questions. That's 20% of the population. So they have a much bigger sampling set. In addition to that, of those 6 people singled out to answer those extra questions, one of them answered even more questions. So you might be lucky enough to have a family member who had to answer all the questions, and you get a much fuller picture of what their life was like. So these are the questions. The first 6 were really noted by the enumerator: name of the street, the house number, serial number for the dwelling, was it a farm or a ranch, so on and so on. I'm not going to read every question to you because I'm going to show you where you can look at what all the questions are later. But this is just to give you an idea. People were asked, all people were asked these questions, which we've seen in other censuses before. Your name, relationship to the household, your age, your sex, your race, your marital status, so on and so on. That slide was out of sequence. Anyway, these questions were also asked of all the people. Of course, if they were 14 years or older, meaning these are questions about work. And they asked a lot of questions about work, whether they were keeping a house or whether they had worked last week, or were they looking for work, and how many hours did they work, and what their occupation was, blah, 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 the class of worker that they were, whether they were employed by a private company or government, or they own their own business. That's all noted in the census. The sampling questions that were asked of the 6 people, many of them concerned last year. Were they living here last year? Did they live on a farm last year? Is this the same county they lived in last year? And it goes on to ask about the highest grade they had finished, whether they had attended school that year, how many weeks they had been looking for work, how much money they had earned. We said 1940, they didn't like those income questions. So now only 6 people per page had to answer anything about income. This is also about income in your home, whether you owned your own business. And if you were male, question 33 pertained to had you ever been in the armed forces? And that can be helpful in looking for additional information. This is the last question asked of only one person, or the last set of questions, I should say. And interestingly, one of the questions they were asked is, if ever married, has the person been married more than once? And how many years since the person last married, divorced, separated, or whatever the case is? And if female, had they ever married, how many children has she born, not counting stillbirths? So you see there's like this evolution of questions and why they're starting to ask different questions. So let's talk about enumeration districts for a second. Since 1880, all the information in the census has been arranged by enumeration district. An enumeration district is the area that can be canvassed by a single enumerator in a census period. Starting in 1930, the enumeration district consisted of 2 numbers. The first part pertained to the state, and the second part pertained to the county. Oh, the first part pertained to the county, and the second place was the specific district. So you'll see New York State, all of 30 will be Nassau County. I'm not sure what it is for New Jersey, but that's where I live, so I know it's 30. If you don't already have an address at which your relatives were living in 1950, there are other resources you can look at. Family-owned addresses, personal letters, vital records, city directories, phone books, naturalization records, draft cards, might give you an indication as to where you should look for your family. Also, just consider asking some relatives that might have been alive at the time where they lived. Once you have an address or even just a street name, you can find the enumeration district or potential enumeration districts through a number of online sources, including NARA, Ancestry, and a site called stevemorris.org, which I don't talk about enough, but I use an awful lot. It's a great website. Steve Morris is a godsend to genealogy. He creates all sorts of cumulative index. It's really good site to check out. So here's that let's search slide again. Searching the 1950 census again, they created this very dirty, quick index using artificial intelligence and OCR. Penmanship equals a messy index, keeping in mind that spelling never counts. That is a very modern day convention. People will still spell things phonetically. You know, you have some line of your family that has 500 spellings of their last name over time. So consider variant spellings when you are searching. I personally recommend that you start with Ancestry.com's enumeration search tool. Instead of going there, these are 2 URLs that I also gave to Allison. She'll share with you later. One is for the National Archive site, and the other is for the Ancestry's index. Now, this can actually be used through Ancestry without a subscription right now. So you can access the 1950 census index without a subscription. And this is it. I took screenshots because I'm always afraid the internet will cut out while I'm doing this stuff. So, although I guess you wouldn't be speaking to me if the internet cut out. This is Ancestry's website. And I want to point out this little section down here that says notify me. If you click on that, you can have Ancestry send you a notification when your state is fully indexed. Now, according to Amy Johnson Crow, it's fully indexed today, but I don't know. I have to see what she has to say. But what you really want to do is when you go to this webpage, you want to click on the Browse Now button. Now, we're going to look at my family. Now, sadly, I cannot find my dad in the census. It breaks my heart, but I have found his cousins. They lived right across the street. Don't ask me why I can't find my dad. I don't know. But my great uncle, James Drew, and my great aunt, Regina Henry Drew, lived at 10 Berkshire Road in Merrick, which is in Nassau County in New York, with their 2 children, Roseanne and Jimmy. That's my known address, 10 Berkshire Road, Merrick, New York. Go back to that Browse Now button, and it's going to have this map where you can go up here and you can actually type in the address you're looking for. And there's a drop-down menu that will appear. I chose the correct address, and it brings up a map, and it shows you what the enumeration district is. 30, again, refers to the county, Nassau County, and the 338 is their district number. And that little pin is showing you where their house was. When you click on that, it will bring you to the federal census for Enumeration District 3338. And you'll see down here, there are 46 pages saying. Now you could click through them all, or you can take that enumeration district right back to this narrow page. Now, before we go any further, I do want to mention this resource tab on the narrow page. There are some great things here, and I know people are not exploring this. They're just jumping in and looking for their family. But this resource page has great stuff. Frequently asked questions, forms, the questions that were asked on the 1950 census. So if you want to read them further, although I covered them pretty intensely, you can go and look at them. Instructions for the enumerators. They have videos on here of how to they promoted answering the census taker when they came to the door. They put it out on television, little ads about the census taker coming to do the census and how important it was to participate in American government. Anyway, check that out. But now that I have the enumeration district 3338, I can go back to this narrow page and begin my search. Now, they give you some tips right here in the center of the page. Again, I don't think people read them. You should, because it's going to tell you some interesting things. Like, for example, you kind of want to look for the head of household because they had their last name and their first name on the same line, whereas the wife, who is listed beneath the husband, so James Drew, have his whole name in the index. His wife, Aunt Jean, will only be listed by Regina. So I start the search. We're going to put in the county. I just wanted to point out how many enumeration districts there were in New York. It's a lot of information, 20,306 enumeration districts. You put in your county, there are 726 enumeration districts in Nassau County. Now I'm going to fill in my family member's name, James Drew. Throw in 3338 for my enumeration district. And you'll see this jumbled mess up here. I don't know what that says, right? Well, welcome to OCR. This census taker had some rough penmanship. And so when the machine reads this, this is how it transcribed it. This Games is James Drew. And there they are. There's the page they are on. There is my James Drew at 10 Berkshire Road, wife Regina, daughter Roseanne, son James. Very often, this is where people stop their research. They don't go further and read all the information about their ages and their races and their sex and their jobs. You should. And that's great if it works. Now, I mentioned before that I can't find my dad in there. So what then? Let's say you don't know where they lived. Try some wild searches. Throw in just a last name, type out a whole name, put in a kid, see what you can come up with. Or you can wait for the full index to be ready, which according to Amy Johnson Crow is today. So maybe you don't have to wait so long. What if you found them in the census, but it says no one's at home? So you didn't find them listed by name, but you found their address and it says no one's home. Remember that the second visit, the second round, the census visit, they began on page 71. So sometimes you have to scroll through that entire enumeration district and look at every page. And what if the house doesn't show up at all, like my dad's? Then you have to start searching the surrounding enumeration districts. Maybe the other census taker in the section south of them or east of them caught that block. You have to look. But the government did make a great effort to try to record everyone. So it's likely your family is in there. And that's my presentation. This is my email address. If you have any questions, you can contact me, but I'm also incredibly happy to answer questions now. I see some in the chat. Oh, these are the links that Allison put up. But if anyone out there has any questions.
I was just trying to unmute myself. I was having technical difficulties. So feel free now, everybody. If you have any questions, has anybody had any experience searching the 1950 census yet?
Hey, Allison and April, it's Michelle. Can you hear me?
Michelle. Yep.
Hey, so
Hi.
Allison knows I did do some searching. I, like you, April, was like there with bells on the first when they were, or the second when they released it. I had a really hard time finding my family. I was super frustrated. And your advice about asking a relative, my dad miraculously remembered the address of his great-grandparents in Brooklyn where they lived. And at the time of the 1950 census, my dad was 6 years old. And they had a really interesting address. It was something like 220 and a half Bergen Street in Brooklyn. And lo and behold, that is where I found them. Yay. So yeah, I'm interested to see what else I can find now that it has allegedly been indexed. But I also wanted to say that I used the tool. Oh gosh, what's the website with the guy's name?
Steve Morse.
Yeah, I've used that multiple times on multiple censuses with a lot of success. So I would also recommend that. And happy hunting. I hope you find your dad.
Thanks. I'm offering a reward for anyone who finds my dad. I mean, I know where he is right now, but I can't find him in that 1950 census. And it's a shame because, I mean, of course, he was an infant living with his parents, but his grandparents also lived with him. So it's like 3 generations of my family. Can't find them.
He's out there. He's out there somewhere.
Out there somewhere. I'm actually most looking forward to the 1960 census. I know I got to wait another 10 years, but my mother and my father lived next door to each other. So my whole family should be there in 1960. Well, we'll see how that goes. That was the first one that was done by mail.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to see how they release those records.
Yeah, I can't imagine what it'll look like. So I wonder if any of our other guests have found their records.
Yeah, yep. Anybody else? Regina?
Oh, okay. I didn't know if it worked. I don't
It
have
worked.
the camera.
We can hear you.
Yes, I also was very active that night. And I did find family. The Ancestry tool is very helpful for finding the enumeration districts. but I did go back and forth between Google Maps and things like that to help me zone in on where the streets were.
Oh,
And
yeah. I didn't
it's-
show that feature, but I'm gonna pull that up on my screen right now and share it. They had this thing where you can zoom in and out of your enumeration district. Let me share my screen.
It was a little confusing too. This is Manhattan. So the blocks of the street, the city blocks seemed almost to be divided in half. One side of the block, and I don't mean across streets, it's like buildings backing up to buildings. They were two different districts, and so it was a little tough to figure it out at first, but I found them.
So it's not, it's not giving me the box. Oh, there it is. Let's put in 10 Berkshire Road, Merrick, Nassau County, search. It zooms right in. There's my little spot. Let me zoom in a little. Okay, so it also has here this tool on the side for opacity, which I thought was really neat. So now you're just looking at the enumeration map from 1950, but if you slide it, start to slide it to the left, what comes through is the present day Google map.
That's cool. That's really cool.
Right, so my grandmother still lives in that house. And you'll see the line, it sort of rolls over into another district. So I've checked 3339, but they're not on there either. Again, there's a reward. If you find my dad, let me know. But it's a cool tool to check out.
I am a little curious about something. I've tried to look it up and I can't find it. Do you know if any of the enumerators that went door to door are still alive?
Wow, I don't know.
I tried to figure how old were you allowed to be an enumerator, and then add on the 72 years, and sure they'd be way up there, but I was just so curious if
That's a
any of
great
them were still
question.
alive.
I haven't heard anything about
There's
that.
a reward. No, I'm only kidding.
I would imagine you would have had to have been at least 18 in order to be an enumerator.
It sounds like something for ABC 7. I don't know. It's just
I bet you there's a living enumerator out there. People live tremendous lives now. Like my grandmother is 93. I saw her in the 1930 census, the 1940 census, the 1950,
Yes.
but I can remember being really excited. Oh, actually, I didn't see her in 1950. She's the one I can't find. But I remember being really excited to show her herself in the 1930 census when it came out. That was in 2002. That was exciting. And there's so much information to be gleaned about your family from there. And I have found so many of my family members, just not my dad. And it was surprisingly easy to find people. I went to the NARA site and I put in April Earle, my great uncle in Nassau County, New York, and it popped up, first one on the list. There he was with his wife, Vera. No struggle, no struggle.
Yes. It's been very interesting.
It is.
I even remember older census. My mother died in 2019, but she would even talk about the apartment, what it was in 1930, and then they moved around a lot. So it was then in 1940 what the apartment was like, and what this, and it was fascinating just to hear about the different apartments and how many floor walk-ups and what, right down to what the courtyard was like. But that's important to hear too.
Yeah, it sparked a lot of conversations with my grandmother when I showed her her block in 1930. She talked about the kid who lived next door and how they changed the name of the street and I think they changed the name of the street in the 40s. They named it after the oldest living woman on the block. And they had done that for several streets in her area. So it became Beck Street after being Fenimore her whole life. It changed. Yeah, it sparks a lot of conversation sometimes to give a family member a prompt. Just today, I was talking about if you interview your family, like an oral history interview, sometimes it helps to bring a document you've already found or a picture and you show someone and it starts a whole conversation. So yeah, and conversations with the living are the most important thing you can do for your genealogy research.
Actually, the challenge that I had, that luckily my dad remembered the address, was the result of the fact that my family in the 1940, 30, and 20 census all lived at the same address in all three of those in a house that they owned. But by 1950, that block had been raised and is now the Gowanus House housing projects. So I had no idea where they went. And turned out they didn't go far, just to Bergen. But that was a huge challenge. And then it led to a whole other research project for me to sort of figure out how it was that my family lost their home to the, New York City Housing Authority. So still haven't gotten quite to the answer of that, but it's been an interesting ride.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Communities change so much in urban areas so quickly. That's, you sort of start to understand those preservation, committees that chain themselves to trees. And
Yep.
we have a woman right now in Nassau County where I live who has chained herself to a tree. That's in front of her family home that she doesn't want torn down, and kind of get it. You kind of get it that everything is changed and how will this make sense later to someone else? Maybe not about a tree, but about a house for sure.
Well, if anybody has not seen, the New York City Archives has tax photos, and they're digitized. They were done in 1939 and 1940. It was a WPA project, and they literally photographed every property in the 5 boroughs. And it's digitized now, and it is searchable. It's easier if you have the lot and the block number you're looking for, but you can do it by address. And that was really great because I was actually able to see a photograph of the house on Bond Street that doesn't exist anymore. So Regina, when you were talking about the apartments in Manhattan, you may actually be able to see what they looked like in 1940. I'll get Allison the website and she can send information out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll include all of these links and in the follow-up email.
Yeah, Google Earth. Now, if you go and you look at my house, you can see my stepmother getting out of her car into the house. And some of those 1930 and 1940 photos shot by the city of New York, those tax photos, show people on the street in front of the houses, not necessarily residents, but you might catch one of your family members on the sidewalks. In March, New York City also digitized their vital records, their historic vital records. If you have family that ever lived in the city of New York, you can now get those birth, marriage, and death records for free through this website. I can send that to Allison as well. I'll look for it, but it's an incredible change for.
It's a really nice change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see, New York City vital records. I just looked at it this morning. You would think the link would be right up front, but it's not.
It's not. That's okay.
No. But there's something to check out. Vital records are important.
Another tool if you're from the area to help you with your census search. So
Yeah, I'm a little biased about New York, I guess, but I feel everybody's family has passed through New York, right?
Yep.
Can't find it, but I'll send it to Allison. It's a great resource for looking for vital records. I used to pay $20 every time I wanted a record from the city of New York. Now you could get it all for free.
Free. Yeah. Is it also a digital record or is it an actual, do they send it in the mail?
It's a digital record right now,
Yeah.
but they're totally downloadable. I
Okay.
also wised up to the thing that they're going to realize how much money they're not making off people. And I have gone in and downloaded every single one I could find, and put them up on Ancestry, copied the images and put them up on Ancestry. So they'll be there.
All right.
All right. Well, I
Anybody
thank you all
else?
for showing up. And I'll throw my email in the chat in case anyone has any questions later that they want to ask me.
Yeah, and feel free to reach out to the library as well. If you have any questions, you can call the Adult Services Desk. We can help you out with anything as much as we can. We will find the answer for you or help you find it. So, and before we end, does anybody have any further questions, comments?
Thank you very much.
All right.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, everybody, for participating tonight. Thank you, April, for
Of course.
your wealth of information. And it's really, so I learned something new every time.
Well, I'm happy to be here, and I wish you all luck in finding your family in there.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great night. Good night.
Thanks, Allison. Good night.
Good
Good night all.